Why Marxist ideas still divide us. In 1917, a small group of revolutionaries overturned centuries of Russian history in just 10 days. 70 years later, the system they built collapsed almost overnight. What happened in between is one of history's most contested stories. Like a powerful storm that appears suddenly on a clear horizon, the Soviet experiment swept across 1/6 of the world's landmass, transforming political landscapes globally. This documentary navigates the complex journey from idealistic beginnings to eventual downfall, exploring how an economic theory developed in Victorian libraries became a force that reshaped entire societies. We'll trace the Soviet Union's evolution through personal stories, never-before-seen archives, and expert analysis, revealing perspectives that challenge conventional understanding. The Industrial Revolution's shadow. In the luminous halls of the Crystal Palace during the Great Exhibition of 1851, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert marveled at the technological wonders that proclaimed Britain as the workshop of the world. Steam engines, mechanical looms, and industrial marvels dazzled visitors from across the globe. This celebration of progress, however, obscured a darker reality unfolding in the shadows of factory chimneys and crowded tenements across England and continental Europe. The glittering machinery on display represented industrial capitalism's dual nature, a double-edged sword that brought unprecedented innovation alongside profound suffering. While the Crystal Palace showcased humanity's mechanical triumphs, the human cost of these advances remained conspicuously absent from the exhibition halls. Behind this facade of Victorian prosperity lay a stark new world. Sarah Golding, a 12-year-old textile worker, testified to a parliamentary committee. "When I was 7, I went to work at Mr. Marshall's factory. We worked from 5 in the morning till 9 at night when they were thronged. The overlooker carried a strap. I have been strapped. I have seen the overlooker stop the girls when going home at night, pull their hair, and beat them." Her story was tragically common in the streets of Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham, which teemed with workers whose lives bore no resemblance to the gleaming narrative of industrial triumph. Children as young as 6 years old worked in factories, their small fingers nimble enough to fix broken threads in textile machines or clear debris from dangerous mechanisms. By 1830 in Britain alone, over 100,000 children under age 13 worked in textile factories, with countless more in mines, brickyards, and chimney sweeping. The factory system had fundamentally transformed human labor. Workers followed the relentless pace of the steam engine and factory whistle, rather than natural rhythms of daylight or seasons. A typical workday stretched from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. in many factories, with brief breaks for meager meals. Factory owners created shift systems that kept production continuous, divorcing workers from any sense of natural time. The economic disparity was stark. A factory owner's annual income of £10,000 in 1850, equivalent to roughly £1.4 million today, dwarfed a male factory worker's yearly wage of £15 to £20. Women earned half that amount, and children as little as 1/4. This income inequality represented fundamentally different lived experiences. Luxury versus bare survival. Friedrich Engels documented these conditions in his 1845 work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Observing Manchester's slums, Engels wrote, "The cottages are old, dirty, and of the smallest sort, the streets uneven, fallen into ruts and in part without drains or pavement. Masses of refuse, awful and sickening filth lie among standing pools in all directions." These environments fostered deadly outbreaks of typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis. The dominant economic theories of the day justified these conditions. Adam Smith's invisible hand and David Ricardo's iron law of wages portrayed market outcomes as natural and inevitable. Thomas Malthus argued that poverty resulted from the poor having too many children, shifting blame from systemic exploitation to its victims. Industrial capitalism created an unprecedented social structure, reducing social relations to a stark binary: those who owned the means of production and those who sold their labor to survive. This new reality couldn't be adequately explained by previous economic frameworks that assumed independent artisans, guild systems, or agricultural patterns of patronage. The massive concentration of urban workers represented a dramatic shift. In 1750, only 15% of Britain's population lived in cities. By 1850, that figure had risen to over 50%. Despite their misery, these communities gained something new: proximity to others sharing their condition. Factory districts became spaces where collective grievances could be articulated and organized into action. Workers began forming combinations, early unions, despite legislation like Britain's Combination Acts that made such organizations illegal. Chartism emerged in the 1830s, demanding universal male suffrage and other democratic reforms. In France, workers participated in the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. These movements often faced brutal repression, as when British cavalry charged into a peaceful crowd at St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819, killing 15 in the Peterloo Massacre. Traditional remedies proved inadequate. Charity couldn't address systematic exploitation. Early factory reforms, like Britain's 1833 Factory Act limiting child labour, were weakly enforced. Electoral politics offered little recourse, since most workers couldn't vote in systems with property qualifications. This tension between wealth creation and widespread misery raised fundamental questions. Was this suffering necessary for progress? Could technological advancement benefit all? Was the relationship between capital and labor inherently exploitative? Writers like Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Victor Hugo captured industrial suffering in novels that stirred middle-class consciences. Utopian socialists like Robert Owen proposed alternative industrial arrangements. Yet these responses didn't offer comprehensive analyses of capitalism's fundamental nature. What was needed was a theoretical framework that could explain not just the symptoms but the underlying causes, a framework that could account for this new economic reality while providing tools for changing it. The concentration of wealth and poverty in industrial Europe created the conditions for understanding that suffering's causes in ways previously impossible. Marx's radical vision. Into this intellectual vacuum stepped a bearded exile spending his days hunched over economic texts in London's British Museum reading room. Karl Marx, a German philosopher forced to flee his homeland after the failed revolutions of 1848, would never lead a protest march, organize a strike, or command revolutionary forces. Yet the ideas flowing from his pen would ultimately reshape nations and transform the lives of billions. Marx arrived in London in 1849, living in poverty with his family in a small Soho apartment. While industrial capitalists amassed fortunes in their mansions, Marx witnessed workers enduring 16-hour shifts in dangerous factories before returning to overcrowded slums. This stark contrast fueled his determination as he methodically constructed an analytical framework explaining capitalism's hidden mechanics. His intellectual journey began with philosophical questions about how humans relate to their labor and the products they create. Marx's approach revolutionized economic thought through his insistence that economic relations form the foundation of all social structures. While contemporaries viewed history as driven by great individuals or religious forces, Marx argued that material conditions, how societies produce and distribute goods, determined everything else. This perspective, known as historical materialism, led him to assert, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." Through his analysis, Marx interpreted history as a progression through distinct economic stages. Ancient slavery gave way to feudalism, which yielded to capitalism, each system containing contradictions that led to its downfall. These transitions occurred through revolutionary ruptures driven by class conflict. His historical analysis positioned capitalism as merely another stage that would eventually be superseded. At the center of Marx's critique lay his theory of surplus value. Building on classical economists like Smith and Ricardo, Marx identified that workers produced more value than they received in wages, with a difference, surplus value, appropriated by capitalists as profit. This exploitation was built into capitalism's very foundation. In Volume 1 of Capital, published in 1867, Marx dissected how this exploitation functioned. The seemingly fair exchange of wages for labor masked a deeper relationship where workers surrendered control over their productive capacity. Capitalists purchased not specific products but labor power itself, the ability to create value over time, allowing for the systematic extraction of surplus value. Marx's analysis extended to capitalism's psychological impact through his concept of alienation. Industrial workers became estranged from the products they created, from their creative potential, from fellow humans, and from their essential nature as creative beings. Factory workers producing thousands of identical items never owned, designed, or witnessed the finished product, reducing labor to merely a means of survival rather than a fulfilling expression of creativity. Marx predicted that capitalism contained internal contradictions leading to its eventual collapse. The tendency for profit rates to fall as competition forced increased mechanization, cycles of boom and bust as production outpaced consumption, and the worsening condition of workers that would spark revolutionary consciousness. Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels presented their revolutionary vision in The Communist Manifesto, 1848. This brief text distilled complex economic analysis into a powerful political statement opening with, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." The manifesto envisioned communism as transcending capitalism, preserving its productive power while eliminating exploitation and alienation. This future society would abolish private ownership of productive property and distribute resources according to need. Production would be controlled collectively, allowing human creativity to flourish. As Marx described it, this society would allow each person to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. Marx spent relatively little time describing this communist future in detail. His work primarily analyzed capitalism's inner workings rather than providing revolutionary blueprints. He believed post-capitalist society would emerge organically from workers' self-organization, not from imposed intellectual plans. Marx died in relative obscurity in 1883, with only 14 people attending his funeral. Engels prophetically declared at his graveside, "His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work." Within decades, revolutions erupted worldwide under the banner of Marxism. Marx's ideas endure through their comprehensive explanation of capitalism as a system. Rather than seeing poverty, inequality, and economic crises as bugs in an otherwise functional system, Marx identified them as intrinsic features. His framework continues resonating in contemporary discussions of exploitation, alienation, class conflict, and economic inequality. Even those rejecting Marx's revolutionary conclusions often find value in his analytical methods. Contemporary movements for economic justice employ Marxist concepts to understand workplace exploitation and environmental degradation. Scholars across disciplines continue drawing on Marxist frameworks to illuminate social dynamics. Marx's complex legacy includes the gap between his theoretical work and its historical implementation. The totalitarian regimes claiming his mantle frequently betrayed his fundamental principle that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. From theory to revolution. The world would first witness Marxist theory transformed into revolutionary practice not in the industrialized nations Marx had anticipated, but in Imperial Russia, a country still emerging from feudalism. While Marx's theories remained largely academic discussions in Western Europe, by 1917 they had become the rallying cry for a new kind of revolution on Russian soil. Russia in 1914 presented the perfect storm of contradictions. The vast empire, ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, combined small pockets of urban industrialization with a predominantly peasant economy, a tiny educated elite governing millions of illiterate subjects, and a political system barely evolved beyond medieval autocracy. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, split between Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, had been spreading Marxist ideas since the century's turn, yet revolution seemed improbable in a nation where industrial workers comprised less than 3% of the population. This fundamental contradiction demanded a theoretical solution. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, recognized that Russia lacked Marx's prerequisites for socialist revolution, a large industrial working class and advanced capitalist development. His response was a significant revision of Marxist theory through the concept of the Vanguard Party, a disciplined group of professional revolutionaries who would guide the masses toward revolution. The working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness. Lenin wrote in What is to be Done, 1902. Instead, he argued, the theory of socialism grew out of theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals. This directly challenged Marx's faith in workers' revolutionary potential. Lenin further developed the theory of imperialism as capitalism's highest stage, arguing that advanced nations exploited colonies in a global system. This theory explained why revolution might occur first in Russia, a weak link in the imperialist chain, rather than in industrialized Germany or Britain. World War I provided the catalyst. By 1917, Russia had suffered over 2 million casualties, while food shortages sparked bread riots in major cities. The February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, establishing a provisional government that fatefully continued Russia's participation in the unpopular war. This new leadership, led initially by Alexander Kerensky, attempted to establish a parliamentary democracy but faced competition from Soviets, councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants that had spontaneously formed across Russia. This created a dual-power situation that Lenin would exploit. In April 1917, Lenin returned to Russia in a sealed train provided by the German government. The journey itself was remarkable, crossing war-torn Europe in a carriage declared extraterritorial, with chalk lines drawn on the floor marking where Russian revolutionaries could interact with German train staff. Upon arrival in Petrograd, he stunned even fellow Bolsheviks with his April theses, rejecting any support for the provisional government and demanding all power to the Soviets. Throughout summer and autumn, the Bolsheviks gained support with their resonant slogans, peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. By October, they controlled majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. On October 25th to 26th, they executed their coup, methodically seizing government buildings, communication centers, and transportation hubs with minimal resistance. That evening, Lenin addressed the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. With these words, theory transformed into revolutionary practice on a national scale. The gap between Marx's theory and Lenin's implementation immediately appeared. Rather than Marx's predicted withering away of the state, Lenin established a highly centralized structure. When the democratically elected Constituent Assembly failed to produce a Bolshevik majority in January 1918, it was forcibly dissolved after a single day's session. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories to end Russia's war participation. This unpopular peace fueled opposition, sparking the Civil War, 1918 to 1922, between the Reds, Bolsheviks, and Whites, anti-Bolshevik forces. During this period, Lenin implemented war communism, nationalizing industry and requisitioning grain from peasants. These emergency measures preserved the revolution but caused widespread suffering. By 1921, industrial production had plummeted to 20% of pre-war levels, while famine claimed millions. Lenin responded with a new economic policy in 1921, reintroducing limited market mechanisms while maintaining state control of key industries. This pragmatic flexibility revealed another distinction between Marx and Lenin, the latter's willingness to adapt theory to practical necessities. Perhaps the most significant departure from Marx was Lenin's approach to revolutionary violence. The Chaika, established in 1918, carried out the Red Terror against real or suspected opponents. While Marx contemplated revolutionary violence, Lenin's systematic state terror established precedents that Stalin would later expand. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had established the USSR, the world's first explicitly Marxist state, albeit based on principles significantly modified by Lenin. The cost had been enormous. Millions dead, democratic institutions suppressed, and one-party rule established. Yet to revolutionary movements worldwide, the Russian Revolution demonstrated something profound. Marxist revolution was possible, even in seemingly unlikely circumstances. China before Mao. As the Soviet experiment unfolded in Russia, China was sinking deeper into a perfect storm of misery that would make Lenin's weak link theory seem almost prophetic. What happens when 400 million peasants, 90% of a country's population, live under a system where some landlords collected up to 80% of harvests while children starved in village after village? The China that would eventually embrace communism in 1949 endured the century of humiliation, a devastating period beginning with the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, when Britain forced China to accept opium imports. The resulting Treaty of Nanking ceded Hong Kong to Britain and opened 5 treaty ports for foreign trade. Defeats followed in the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, and the Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, with the latter particularly crushing Chinese pride as Japan seized Taiwan and extracted massive reparations. By 1900, China had been carved into spheres of influence by multiple foreign powers, while the Qing dynasty proved incapable of resistance. The Boxer Rebellion's defeat by an 8-nation alliance resulted in crushing indemnities. This foreign dismemberment, combined with internal feudal oppression, created wounds that cut deeply into the Chinese national psyche. In Shanghai's international settlement, signs declaring "No dogs or Chinese allowed" in certain parks represented the daily indignities suffered under foreign control. Within this fractured nation, peasant life was unbearable. A farmer from Hunan province described his family's existence. "We worked from sunrise to sunset on land our ancestors had farmed for generations, yet the landlord took so much that my children's ribs showed through their skin. My youngest daughter died during the winter because we couldn't afford both food and medicine. The landlord's son had a birthday celebration that same week that cost more than what my family earned in a year." The land tenure system concentrated ownership among a small elite. In many regions, less than 10% of families owned 70 to 80% of arable land. Village gentry extracted exorbitant rents while serving as local magistrates and militia leaders, wielding almost total power. Peasants frequently borrowed at 30 to 50% interest rates annually just to survive between harvests. Women faced additional burdens, including foot binding and exclusion from education, while child mortality exceeded 30% in rural areas. Natural disasters became catastrophic under this system. During the North China famine of 1920 to 1921, approximately 500,000 died despite adequate grain reserves in nearby provinces. Landlords and merchants hoarded supplies waiting for price increases while villagers starved. This agrarian crisis occurred amid political chaos. After the 1911 revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty, China fractured under competing warlords who imposed additional taxes and conscription on peasants. The Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek unified part of the country by 1927, but focused more on suppressing communists than addressing rural suffering. The Japanese invasion beginning in 1931 brought unprecedented suffering, claiming an estimated 14 to 20 million Chinese civilian lives by 1945. In certain regions, Japanese forces implemented a three-alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. The Nanjing Massacre of 1937 to 1938 saw tens of thousands of civilians murdered in just 6 weeks. The nationalist government's response further alienated the population. Hyperinflation reached 83,000% annually by 1948. One government worker recalled, "My monthly salary could buy 4 eggs on the first day of the month, but only 1 egg by month's end." Corruption was endemic, with officials diverting American aid to the black market while soldiers went unfed. When nationalist troops returned to territories after Japan's defeat, they often behaved like conquerors, taking food from starving peasants. Traditional Confucian values and institutions proved inadequate for industrial-age challenges and resisting imperialism. The nationalists' New Life movement appeared as empty moralizing rather than meaningful reform. Democratic principles gained little traction beyond urban centers in a society with over 80% illiteracy. Against this backdrop, the Communist Party gradually transformed from a small urban organization into a rural revolutionary force. After nearly being destroyed by Chiang Kai-shek's purge in 1927, surviving communists retreated to the countryside where they adapted Marxist theory to China's conditions. By implementing land reform in areas under their control during the war against Japan, communists addressed peasants' immediate concern: access to land. They created literacy programs and health campaigns that demonstrated practical benefits. Women were encouraged to participate in production and governance. Most significantly, communist cadres lived alongside the peasants, sharing hardships rather than extracting wealth. This ground-level connection contrasted sharply with nationalist officials who were often perceived as distant and corrupt. As civil war erupted following Japan's defeat in 1945, Mao's revolution. This ground-level strategy reflected something far more significant than clever tactics. It represented the most dramatic theoretical departure from orthodox Marxism the world had yet seen. In a move that would have shocked Marx himself, Mao Zedong was about to turn revolutionary theory upside down by placing peasants, not factory workers, at the center of his revolution. Born to a farming family in Hunan province in 1893, Mao developed revolutionary sentiments through his intense nationalism and desire to save China from foreign imperialism and domestic exploitation. His exposure to Marxist ideas at Beijing University, combined with his direct experience organizing among China's vast peasantry, shaped his revolutionary approach. By 1927, Mao reached a conclusion that shattered core Marxist doctrine. In his report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan, he wrote, "Several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back." This assertion directly challenged Marx's insistence that only the industrial proletariat possessed revolutionary potential. This theoretical shift was seismic, like redirecting a powerful river from its established course into entirely new terrain. For orthodox Marxists, peasants were considered politically unreliable, tied to private property through their desire to own land. Marx himself had dismissed the peasantry as a sack of potatoes, individual units incapable of collective action. Yet Mao staked everything on precisely this class that Marx had written off. When Chiang Kai-shek's 1927 purge forced the communists underground, Mao retreated to the Jinggang Mountains where he began refining People's War, a revolutionary strategy built around mobilizing peasants rather than urban workers. In the Jiangxi Soviet, established in 1931, Mao implemented radical land reform, redistributing property from landlords to poor peasants, proving far more effective at building support than abstract discussions of proletarian consciousness. The Long March, covering over 6,000 miles through difficult terrain, became a defining mythological moment that cemented Mao's leadership. At the Junyi Conference in January 1935, Mao successfully challenged the Soviet-trained faction, gaining control of military decision-making. This physical journey through China's heartland paralleled Mao's intellectual journey away from orthodox Marxism. Once established in Yan'an, Mao fully articulated his theoretical innovations. In his 1937 essay on practice, he declared, "The standpoint of practice is the primary and basic standpoint in the dialectical materialist theory of knowledge." This meant theory must emerge from direct experience rather than dogmatic adherence to texts, justifying the abandonment of Marx's urban-focused revolution in favor of China's reality as a peasant society. Mao further developed these ideas in On Contradiction and On New Democracy, arguing that China's revolution would necessarily differ from Russia's because of different historical conditions. He proposed a new democratic phase that would precede true socialism, allowing for temporary alliances with the national bourgeoisie against Japanese imperialism. The Japanese invasion in 1937 created perfect conditions for Mao's strategy. Communist guerrillas remained behind enemy lines, organizing peasant resistance with tactics emphasizing mobility. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy halts, we harass. When the enemy tires, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue. The Communists established themselves as defenders of the Chinese people by implementing disciplined conduct among their forces, creating stark contrast with both Japanese brutality and Kuomintang corruption. By living among peasants while organizing them for self-defense, they built deep rural support. When civil war erupted after Japan's defeat in 1945, the Communists had transformed from a small band to a formidable force with a vast rural network. Though the nationalists received American aid and controlled major cities, they couldn't match the Communists' organization and popular support. Mao's military strategy during the Civil War involved surrounding urban centers from the countryside, unlike traditional communist insurrections focused on worker uprisings in cities. In 3 campaigns between 1948 and 1949, Communist forces systematically destroyed nationalist armies. His ideological adaptations made revolutionary ideology more accessible by integrating Chinese cultural elements and nationalist sentiment. His concept of the mass line, from the masses to the masses, emphasized leadership must remain connected to ordinary people's concerns. By 1949, the Communists had captured Beijing, and on October 1st, Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China from Tiananmen Square. Mao's innovations transformed revolutionary theory globally. His peasant revolution model provided a template for anti-colonial struggles across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Figures like Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh and Cuba's Che Guevara adapted Mao's approach to their contexts. Most significantly, Mao's willingness to adapt Marxist theory to Chinese reality established a precedent for theoretical flexibility in revolutionary movements worldwide. By prioritizing practical results over dogma, he created space for revolutionary theory to evolve based on local conditions rather than rigid adherence to European models. The Great Leap Forward and Back. While Mao's adaptations of Marxist theory proved devastatingly effective at winning power, could the same revolutionary principles build a functioning society? The early communist period in China presents us with a striking paradox. Genuine social improvements occurring alongside one of history's greatest human-made disasters. In the aftermath of the 1949 revolution, the Chinese Communist Party embarked on a massive reconstruction effort. The new government inherited a devastated country where infrastructure had been destroyed by decades of warfare. Between 1950 and 1952, the party implemented what it called the period of recovery, focusing on stabilizing the economy and introducing initial reforms that would dramatically reshape Chinese society. The early communist period brought tangible improvements to millions of Chinese citizens. Land reform gave approximately 300 million landless peasants their own plots to cultivate. Agricultural production increased by 15% between 1949 and 1952 as farmers, now working for themselves rather than landlords, demonstrated improved productivity. A woman from rural Shaanxi province later recalled, "When they measured out our land and handed us the deed, my father wept. For generations our family had worked others' fields, but now this small plot belonged to us. That night we slept differently, knowing the land beneath our home was truly ours. Public health initiatives trained over 100,000 barefoot doctors for rural communities. Infant mortality fell from 200 deaths per 1,000 births to 140 by 1957. Life expectancy rose from 35 years to 57 years by the late 1950s. Education expanded dramatically. Primary school enrollment more than doubled to 63 million students by 1956. The literacy rate improved from 20% to approximately 66% by the end of the 1950s. Women's rights advanced through the 1950 marriage law, which abolished arranged marriages and established women's right to divorce and own property. Female literacy increased substantially as girls gained access to education. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, with female employment rising by over 30% in urban areas. A factory worker from Shanghai described this transformation. Before liberation, women in my neighborhood rarely left their homes. After 1949, we worked alongside men in factories, attended literacy classes in the evenings, and participated in neighborhood committees. My mother could never have imagined such a life. These promising beginnings, however, gave way to catastrophe when revolutionary zeal replaced practical governance. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, aiming to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. Local officials, competing to demonstrate revolutionary fervor, reported impossible grain harvests. One province claimed yields 7 times higher than reality. These fictional statistics led the government to increase grain procurement quotas while food supplies dwindled. Exports continued. Reserves emptied. Rural areas starved. Collectivization erased the incentives that had improved productivity. Farmers who had briefly tasted ownership were forced into massive communes where all aspects of life came under state control. By 1959, over 99% of rural households had been incorporated into these communes, stripping peasants of their recently acquired land and autonomy. The regime silenced agricultural experts. Pseudo-scientific farming techniques flourished. Crops failed. Insect populations exploded after the misguided campaign to eliminate sparrows. Food production collapsed. Famine spread. As hunger intensified, the government continued requisitioning grain at unsustainable levels. A survivor from Anhui province later testified, "In my village, people ate bark from trees and boiled leather belts for soup. When there was nothing left, we ate dirt mixed with whatever scraps we could find. Each morning, we checked which families had survived the night. My younger brother, only 6, grew so weak he couldn't stand. Mother gave him her portion, but it wasn't enough. The day he died, officials came to collect more grain. They stepped over his body as if he were nothing, as if all our suffering were nothing." Between 1959 and 1962, an estimated 30 to 45 million Chinese citizens died from starvation and related illnesses. In hardest-hit provinces, mortality rates reached catastrophic levels. Some counties lost over 10% of their population. These deaths resulted not from natural disaster, but from catastrophic policy failures and the party's refusal to acknowledge reality until too late. By 1962, even the Communist Party leadership could no longer ignore the catastrophe. The Great Leap Forward was abandoned. More moderate figures implemented recovery measures. Peasants received small private plots again. Agricultural production stabilized. The economy slowly recovered. The tragic irony of this period lies in its contradictions. The revolution delivered genuine advances in literacy, healthcare access, women's rights, and land reform that transformed millions of lives. Yet these same years saw policies that claimed tens of millions of lives through ideologically driven mismanagement. The revolution had simultaneously fulfilled many promises while inflicting unprecedented suffering on the very people it claimed to serve. Cultural Revolution and its aftermath. After the catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward, you might expect China's leadership to abandon radical experimentation. Yet what followed instead would shatter Chinese society in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. While recovering from history's deadliest famine, Mao became increasingly concerned about the direction of the Chinese Revolution. By 1966, he had grown suspicious of his own party leadership, believing they were taking a capitalist road that betrayed revolutionary principles. On May 16, 1966, Mao officially launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Unlike previous campaigns focused on economic transformation, this movement targeted Chinese culture itself. Mao declared war on the four olds, old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, that he claimed prevented China from achieving true socialism. The movement began in Beijing's universities, where Mao's wife Jiang Qing helped orchestrate attacks against university administrators. When the president of Beijing University, Liu Ping, attempted to limit political activities on campus, wall posters appeared denouncing him as a bourgeois academic authority. Within weeks, students formed militant Red Guard organizations across the country, responding to Mao's call to bombard the headquarters of those supposedly undermining revolution. The Cultural Revolution's distinctive feature was Mao's deliberate circumvention of normal party structures. He empowered teenagers and young adults as revolutionary vanguards, creating a personality cult that elevated his thoughts, collected in the Little Red Book, to sacred status. At mass rallies in Tiananmen Square, a sea of red armband-wearing youth would surge like waves, over 1 million Red Guards waving their books while chanting devotion to Chairman Mao. Violence escalated with shocking speed. Red Guards swept through urban neighborhoods like tempests, conducting house-to-house searches, confiscating anything deemed bourgeois. Religious sites became particular targets. Thousands of temples and monasteries were ransacked, with irreplaceable artifacts destroyed. Wang Yuqin, who later became a primary chronicler of Cultural Revolution atrocities, provided haunting first-hand testimony. We watched our literature teacher being beaten with belt buckles until her face was unrecognizable and covered with blood. They forced her to crawl on broken glass while confessing her crimes of teaching bourgeois literature. Such ritualized humiliation manifested in public struggle sessions, where victims stood before crowds while being denounced for hours, often while holding painful stress positions. Wu Ningquan, a professor who had returned from America to help build the new society, embodied the betrayal felt by intellectuals. Labeled a reactionary academic authority, he was paraded through streets wearing a dunce cap and sign detailing his crimes, while crowds shouted down with a counter-revolutionary revisionist. The assault on education closed schools and universities for years as students abandoned classrooms for revolutionary activities. The campaign against intellectuals extended to China's cultural foundations. Scientists, writers, and professors were sent to rural labor camps for re-education. The playwright Wu Han died in prison after writing a historical play interpreted as criticizing Mao. Ancient temples were repurposed as storage facilities or factories. Even Confucius's grave was desecrated, attacking the philosophical cornerstone of Chinese ethical thought. By 1967, the violence spiraled beyond Mao's control. Different Red Guard factions fought each other, each claiming supreme loyalty to Mao's thought. Parts of the country descended into civil war conditions. In Guangxi province, rival revolutionary groups engaged in mass killings that reportedly included instances of ritualistic cannibalism. Recognizing the threat to national stability by 1968, Mao deployed the military and sent millions of urban youth to the countryside to learn from the peasants. This rustication program relocated approximately 17 million young Chinese to remote rural areas, where many remained for a decade or more. The political impact reached the highest levels of government. Liu Shaoqi, China's head of state and Mao's designated successor, was stripped of all positions, imprisoned, and denied medical treatment until his death in 1969. Deng Xiaoping was purged twice and sent to work in a tractor repair factory. The Cultural Revolution's human toll defies simple measurement. Death estimates range from several 100,000 to over 2 million. Millions more suffered torture, imprisonment, or permanent disability. The psychological damage fractured Chinese society as citizens betrayed friends and family to prove revolutionary loyalty, creating familial wounds that remain unhealed today. The campaign ended only with Mao's death in 1976 and the subsequent arrest of the Gang of Four, including Mao's wife Jiang Qing. When asked during her trial about the number of people persecuted, Jiang Qing replied, "I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whoever he told me to bite, I bit." Beyond the human suffering, China faced devastating economic and cultural losses. Industrial production plummeted as factories fell under ideological control. Countless historical artifacts, manuscripts, and artworks vanished forever. The social fabric itself tore as traditional values of scholarship, family loyalty, and civil discourse were branded reactionary. When China began rebuilding in the late 1970s, it faced not just economic recovery, but cultural reconstruction from the ashes of revolution. Cuba's revolutionary path. As China struggled to recover from its self-inflicted cultural wounds, a Caribbean island nation was charting an unexpected revolutionary course that would confound global expectations. How did a movement that began as an anti-corruption campaign against a US-backed dictator transform into one of history's most enduring socialist states, despite having almost none of the conditions Marx believed necessary for revolution? When Fidel Castro led his small band of guerrilla fighters to victory in January 1959, Cuba was a nation of stark contrasts. While Havana's casinos catered to wealthy Americans, rural Cubans faced crushing poverty. Many families lived in bohíos, simple palm-thatched huts with dirt floors and no electricity or running water. Under Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship, American companies controlled 75% of Cuba's fertile land, 90% of its utilities, and 40% of its sugar production, the island's economic lifeblood. Agricultural workers remained employed only 4 months per year during the sugar harvest season, creating a cycle of seasonal unemployment and perpetual poverty. The Cuban revolutionary movement emerged as a nationalist resistance against corruption and foreign domination. Castro himself came from a wealthy landowning family and studied law at the University of Havana. His earliest political manifesto, History Will Absolve Me, delivered after his failed 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks, emphasized restoring constitutional democracy, land reform, and Cuban sovereignty. This origin story marks a critical difference between Cuba's revolution and those of Russia and China. While Lenin's Bolsheviks and Mao's Communist Party founded themselves on Marxist principles, Castro's July 26 movement presented itself as a democratic, anti-corruption force. Many early supporters, including numerous middle-class Cubans, backed what they believed was a movement for constitutional restoration. "I am not a communist, and neither is the revolutionary movement," Castro declared in a 1959 interview with American television. Within 2 years, however, this position dramatically shifted as geopolitical realities pushed Cuba toward socialism. The transformation accelerated following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. 1 month after CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow the new government, Castro publicly declared the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution. By December 1961, he proclaimed himself a Marxist-Leninist and aligned Cuba with the Soviet bloc. Cuba's revolution adopted socialism as a pragmatic response to immediate challenges. The United States' increasingly hostile stance, culminating in the full economic embargo imposed in February 1962, left Cuba isolated and desperate for allies. The Soviet Union offered economic support, agreeing to purchase Cuban sugar at preferential prices and provide oil, machinery, and technical assistance. Unlike both Lenin and Mao, who emphasized the Communist Party as vanguard, Castro's revolution centered around charismatic personal leadership. This personalized approach produced remarkable stability. Fidel remained Cuba's undisputed leader for 47 years, spanning 9 U.S. presidencies. The revolutionary government quickly transformed daily life. Before 1959, Maria Rodriguez, a sugar worker's wife, watched her children grow thin during the dead season between harvests. By 1961, her family received guaranteed rations, her children attended newly built rural schools, and medical clinics appeared in her previously neglected village. A nationwide literacy campaign reduced illiteracy from 24% to less than 4% that same year. Cuba's healthcare system became one of the revolution's most celebrated achievements. Infant mortality dropped from 37.3 per thousand live births in 1959 to 4.0 by 2020, lower than the United States. Life expectancy rose from 59 years before the revolution to 79 years today. Housing improved dramatically when the Urban Reform Law of 1960 converted renters into homeowners and slashed housing costs from 35% of family income to just 10%. Race relations advanced significantly with the dismantling of formal segregation in beaches, parks, and schools. These social achievements came with costs to individual liberties. The government nationalized businesses, restricted press freedom, and implemented a one-party system. From 1965 to 1968, suspected homosexuals were sent to military units to aid production, essentially labor camps, reflecting an authoritarian strain that continued throughout Castro's rule. The economic model faced persistent challenges. Dependency on sugar exports and Soviet subsidies masked fundamental weaknesses. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba's GDP plummeted by over 35% during this special period, forcing pragmatic adaptations while maintaining its socialist system. Cuba's revolutionary experience included a significant internationalist dimension. Between 1975 and 1991, over 425,000 Cuban soldiers served abroad, particularly in Angola. Cuba simultaneously established medical diplomacy by sending thousands of healthcare workers to developing nations. The revolution's survival, despite multiple crises, represents an extraordinary historical anomaly. It defied both American expectations of imminent collapse and traditional Marxist assumptions about necessary preconditions for socialist revolution. Cuba today presents a complicated legacy. Its achievements in healthcare and education stand alongside persistent food shortages, crumbling infrastructure, and limitations on civil liberties that have prompted waves of emigration, including the ongoing crisis sending hundreds of thousands of Cubans to the U.S. since 2021. The Cuban experience raises profound questions about revolutionary socialism's adaptability. If a small agricultural island dominated by foreign capital could establish and maintain socialism for over 6 decades, what does this suggest about the fundamental nature of revolutionary socialism? Proved far more flexible than Marx imagined, but this adaptability came with an unacknowledged price tag. The same revolutionary governments that built schools and hospitals also constructed prison cells for poets, priests, and political opponents, creating a moral paradox that continues to haunt socialist experiments worldwide. In each revolutionary society, a familiar pattern emerged. Initial promises of liberation gave way to increasingly rigid control. This reflected a fundamental tension within revolutionary theory itself. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 8 years in Soviet labor camps before becoming one of the regime's most powerful critics, observed, "Unlimited power in the hands of limited people always leads to cruelty." The The contradiction between collective goals and individual rights manifested early in the Soviet experience. While the Bolsheviks had championed workers' control before taking power, Lenin quickly moved to centralize economic decision-making. When workers at the Putilov factory in Petrograd struck in 1918 to protest food shortages, they were denounced as counter-revolutionary. The right to strike, once considered fundamental, was effectively abolished in a workers' state. This pattern of restricting dissent in the name of revolutionary progress extended to intellectual and cultural life. Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet physicist who helped develop the hydrogen bomb before becoming a dissident, described how he had been completely taken in by the propaganda before gradually awakening to the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and reality. Religious believers faced particular hardship across revolutionary societies. In the Soviet Union, over 50,000 Orthodox priests were executed between 1917 and 1941. This staggering figure represents more than statistics. Each number was an individual whose elimination was justified through revolutionary ideology, a corrosive process that transformed liberation movements into instruments of oppression. Revolutionary states justified these restrictions through consistent mechanisms. Opposition was typically framed as representing class enemies whose interests inherently opposed the revolution. Additionally, revolutionary states justified censorship as necessary for building ideological unity. As Václav Havel observed, the regime is captive to its own lies. It must falsify everything. Self-censorship became particularly powerful. Students and intellectuals monitored their own thoughts and speech long before authorities intervened. Zhang Zhixin, executed in 1975 for criticizing Mao, wrote, "The ultimate purpose of a revolution is to liberate people, not to constrain them." This pattern of control distorted the very revolutionary ideals that had inspired millions. Milo Vangelos analyzed this process in The New Class, arguing that revolutionary parties formed a new privileged class that used state control to maintain its position rather than fulfill promised social transformation. The repressive apparatus of revolutionary states manifested in brutal detention systems. The Soviet Gulag, Chinese reform through labor camps, and Cuba's UMAP facilities processed millions deemed politically unreliable. These institutions functioned like an autoimmune disease in the revolutionary body. Designed to protect the revolution, they ultimately attacked its vital organs: justice, equality, and human dignity. Wei Jingsheng, who spent nearly 18 years in Chinese prisons, captured the psychological devastation. The most frightening aspect of imprisonment is the knowledge that you might never be set free. This fear extended beyond prison walls to society at large, where revolutionary legal systems rejected judicial independence in favor of explicitly political law designed to protect revolutionary achievements rather than individual rights. Perhaps most insidiously, revolutionary control corrupted language itself. Terms like freedom, democracy, and rights were redefined to serve revolutionary goals. East Germany called itself the German Democratic Republic, while building the Berlin Wall. This corruption of language made genuine political discourse nearly impossible, creating what Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski called a divided life, separating public performance from private thoughts. What explains this persistent pattern? Marx had focused primarily on economic transformation and assumed political freedoms would naturally follow material equality. However, revolutionary practice required immediate control of political and cultural institutions to implement economic changes. The concept of a vanguard party created a hierarchy between those with correct revolutionary consciousness and the masses who needed guidance. External pressures also played a significant role. Revolutionary states faced threats from counter-revolutionary forces and foreign intervention. The CIA's operations against Cuba reinforced the government's siege mentality. Western intervention against the Bolsheviks strengthened hardliners who argued extraordinary measures were necessary for survival. Yet the consistency with which revolutionary states restricted individual freedoms suggests a deeper contradiction between revolutionary transformation and pluralistic rights. The urgency of revolutionary change required centralized control that proved difficult to relinquish even after immediate threats passed. George Orwell captured this contradiction in Animal Farm, when the revolutionary slogan, "All animals are equal," transformed into "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." His critique was not of revolutionary goals, but of how power corrupted those goals, turning the medicine of liberation into a poison that slowly killed the patient it was meant to save. Revolutionary legacies. Orwell's critique targeted implementation, not ideals, because beneath the authoritarian distortions lay genuine social transformations that outlived the regimes themselves. When Eastern Europeans took to the streets in 1989, they were rejecting one-party rule and secret police, but many fought to preserve social systems that had transformed millions of lives. The fall of the Berlin Wall revealed a striking historical contradiction. As communist governments collapsed, their most enduring legacy wasn't ideological control, but expanded social rights that had become embedded in global expectations. Like autumn leaves falling while their trees prepare for renewal, these hardline regimes withered away even as their social achievements remained rooted in the societies they had governed. This paradox defines the revolutionary legacy. Consider Poland's Solidarity movement, which opposed communist rule while defending worker protections and universal health care. The movement's significance becomes clear through historian Timothy Garton Ash's documentation of striking workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, who demanded both free trade unions and the preservation of social guarantees. Their 21 demands reflected a desire to reform the system, not abandon its core social achievements. Throughout the former Eastern Bloc, citizens overwhelmingly supported maintaining universal education, healthcare access, and workplace protections. Surveys conducted in the early 1990s showed over 70% of respondents in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland opposed dismantling these systems even as they embraced political liberalization. These social advances originated in revolutionary upheavals, but eventually influenced policy far beyond socialist borders. Sweden's comprehensive welfare state emerged partly in response to working-class mobilization influenced by socialist ideas. The Social Democratic Party implemented universal health care, free education, and extensive worker protections while maintaining a market economy. Britain's National Health Service, established in 1948, reflected pressure from labor movements with strong socialist elements. The post-war consensus in Western Europe incorporated key social demands from revolutionary movements while rejecting their authoritarian political models. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy developed extensive social safety nets, co-determined corporate governance structures, and strong labor protections. Political scientist Gösta Esping-Andersson observed that the welfare state acknowledged certain socialist critiques of capitalism were valid. This policy convergence between East and West represented the Great Transformation, the recognition across ideological divides that modern societies required social protections alongside market mechanisms. Even the United States expanded Social Security, established Medicare and Medicaid, and strengthened labor rights during this period. The contrast between social achievements and economic failures remains the central tension in evaluating revolutionary legacies. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy struggled with chronic shortages and technological backwardness. East Germany couldn't match West German living standards despite its comprehensive welfare state. Cuba's universal health care produced impressive results, but couldn't compensate for broader economic stagnation. Yet these economic shortcomings shouldn't obscure genuine accomplishments in human development. Revolutionary regimes dramatically reduced illiteracy across vast territories. Women gained unprecedented legal equality, access to education, and workforce participation. Public health campaigns eliminated diseases that had plagued populations for centuries. The numbers tell a compelling story. In 1917, only 24% of Russians could read. By 1939, literacy reached 87%. In China, female literacy jumped from under 10% before the revolution to over 70% by 1990. Life expectancy in the Soviet Union rose from 44 years in 1927 to 69 by 1970. Socialist countries consistently outperformed capitalist nations at similar economic development levels in basic human development indicators. These advances have proven remarkably durable. When Soviet-aligned states collapsed in the early 1990s, foreign advisors often pressured governments to dismantle social programs, yet citizens fought to preserve them. Countries like Vietnam and China have embraced market reforms while maintaining commitments to universal education and expanding healthcare coverage. Revolutionary movements transformed global expectations about social rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, included economic and social rights alongside political freedoms. Articles 22 to 26 established rights to social security, work, rest, adequate living standards, and education, concepts championed by revolutionary movements. This legacy continues to shape contemporary movements for economic justice. Today's activists for universal healthcare, free education, and workplace democracy often explicitly reject the authoritarian aspects of historical socialism while drawing on its critique of inequality. Democratic socialist movements represent this synthesis, combining revolutionary analysis with democratic commitments. What emerges from this complex history is an understanding that revolutionary movements simultaneously produced both remarkable achievements and tragic failures. Their most positive legacy may be the recognition that economic systems must serve human development, not merely generate wealth. Even critics of revolutionary politics now widely accept that markets require social constraints and that economic growth without equitable distribution creates unstable societies. This doesn't excuse the repression that characterized these regimes. No social advance can compensate for the denial of basic freedoms. Rather, it suggests that revolutionary movements contained both liberatory and authoritarian elements, with the former sometimes outlasting the latter. Political scientist Nancy Fraser captures this tension. Revolutionary movements articulated genuine emancipatory demands arising from real oppression. Their failure wasn't in identifying problems, but in believing that replacing one form of concentrated power with another would solve them. The challenge for contemporary movements is to preserve the emancipatory vision while finding more democratic paths to realization. Marx in the modern world. This contradictory legacy didn't fade with the 20th century. It erupted with renewed force in 2008 when global capitalism itself seemed to falter. As markets crashed and governments scrambled to save financial institutions, something unexpected happened in bookstores across Europe and America. Sales of Marx's Das Kapital surged by over 300%. Publishers rushed to print new editions, while university courses on Marxist theory filled with students who had been children when the Berlin Wall fell. The financial crisis exposed vulnerabilities in a system many had considered unassailable. When taxpayers funded massive bailouts for banks while millions lost their homes, Marx's analysis of capitalism prioritizing profit over human needs resonated with a generation facing precarious employment, mounting debt, and diminishing prospects. One bookseller in London observed that customers were young professionals and students seeking frameworks to understand a system that had betrayed their expectations. This renewed interest emerged organically from the contradictions of modern capitalism. Since the 1980s, wealth concentration has reached levels unseen since before the Great Depression. In the United States, the top 1% of households now hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Meanwhile, wage growth has decoupled from productivity gains. Between 1979 and 2020, productivity rose by 61.8%, while hourly compensation increased by just 17.5%. precisely the contradiction Marx identified between capital accumulation and labor compensation. The Occupy movement's focus on the 99% versus the 1% directly reflected these economic realities while drawing on Marx's class analysis. However, participants overwhelmingly rejected the authoritarian models of 20th-century communist states, demonstrating how contemporary movements have learned from historical failures. Climate activism similarly draws on Marxist concepts regarding the relationship between economic systems and ecological sustainability. The critique that capitalism's growth imperative fundamentally opposes environmental limits gains traction as climate impacts accelerate. During a 2019 protest, one young climate activist stated, "The same system extracting value from workers is extracting it from the planet. Both are treated as infinitely exploitable resources." Contemporary thinkers have worked to separate Marx's diagnosis of capitalism's contradictions from the failed prescriptions of 20th-century revolutions. Economist Thomas Piketty's 2013 book, Capital in the 21st Century, consciously referenced Marx's work while proposing remedies like progressive taxation and democratic reforms rather than revolutionary overthrow, reflecting a post-Cold War pragmatism that borrows analytical tools while rejecting revolutionary politics. Digital technology has transformed both capitalism and resistance to it. Platform companies like Amazon exemplify what critics call surveillance capitalism, where data extraction creates unprecedented wealth concentration while workers face algorithm-managed conditions. These technologies enable new forms of organizing, as demonstrated when Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, attempted to unionize in 2021, coordinating via social media and receiving worldwide support. Globalization presents challenges Marx anticipated. When factory workers in Bangladesh make clothes for European consumers, they experience exploitation that transcends national boundaries. Marx and Engels foresaw this global dimension of capitalism in 1848, writing that the bourgeoisie compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. The COVID-19 pandemic intensified interest in alternative economic frameworks. Billionaire wealth expanded by $3.9 trillion during 2020, while workers faced mass unemployment, exposing and exacerbating existing inequalities. A 2021 survey found 54% of American adults under 30 held unfavorable views of capitalism, the highest percentage in a decade of polling. Today's Marxist-influenced movements differ significantly from their predecessors. Rather than vanguard parties seeking state power, contemporary movements emphasize horizontal organizing and reform within democratic systems. The Democratic Socialists of America, which grew from 6,000 to over 90,000 members between 2016 and 2021, pursues electoral politics and mutual aid rather than revolutionary overthrow. This evolution reflects hard lessons from history. Contemporary leftists explicitly reject the one-party state model in favor of democratic pluralism. As Democratic Socialist Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stated, "We should be scared about socialism in the same way that we're scared about capitalism without regulation, that we're scared about capitalism without democracy." Academic approaches to Marx have evolved from dogma to critical engagement. Feminist Marxists extend his analysis to unpaid domestic labor, while environmental Marxists examine capitalism's relationship with nature. These developments suggest Marx's method, materialist analysis of economic systems, remains valuable even as specific conclusions require revision. The Internet has democratized access to Marxist theory through YouTube channels and podcasts like Chopo Trap House that blend leftist analysis with humor, attracting audiences who might never read dense 19th century economic texts. In Latin America, movements combining indigenous rights, environmentalism, and critique of neoliberalism explicitly reject Soviet-style centralization while maintaining a critical stance toward global capitalism. Contemporary Marxist-influenced thinkers focus more on identifying possibilities within the present than predicting capitalism's collapse. They advocate building alternative economic institutions, cooperatives, public banks, commons-based initiatives that demonstrate different ways of organizing production and distribution. This shift from revolution to transformation acknowledges that previous revolutionary attempts often replaced one form of hierarchy with another. The enduring relevance of Marxist ideas despite state socialism's collapse suggests they tap into fundamental economic experiences: exploitation, vast wealth alongside persistent poverty, and labor alienated from authentic desires, providing explanatory power even as his prescribed solutions face justified skepticism. Our journey through the legacy of Marxism reveals a profound paradox. Ideas meant to liberate humanity often became tools of oppression when implemented. Yet their influence extends far beyond the regimes they inspired. Today, as wealth concentrates at levels reminiscent of Marx's era, his analytical framework offers valuable insights while many reject authoritarian systems built in his name. Like a compass that survived the shipwreck of failed utopias, Marx's methodology endures, questioning economic structures that shape our lives and societies. Consider how this lens might illuminate today's challenges. Marx's legacy isn't revolution, but rather the tools to